Shadows and shading in your artwork is one of those things that often goes unnoticed if it's done well. But kind of like audio at a concert, if something goes wrong, like somebody's mic goes out or something squeaks, suddenly everybody notices and is totally distracted by it. So shading is the same way. If you do it right, is going to compliment how you created that shadow. But if you do it incorrectly, everybody's going to kind of be distracted by it. And so today I'm going to share with you 5 of my favorite tips for creating shadows with watercolor so that you can avoid the eyesore. Tip number 1 is to make sure that your light source is consistent. So whether that is the sun or a highlight of some sort, it needs to be consistent throughout your piece. If you have a flower that has a shadow on the left side over here and then a shadow on the right side over here, it's going to be very confusing to your viewer and automatically look strange. So for example, I have 2 light sources with me here. I have a lamp over here and I have a lamp over here. But if I turn one off, the shadows become really evident. And this is what you want to do with your artwork. You want to exaggerate it even if possible, just to make sure that it's very clear to your viewer what's going on. And the way that we keep our shadows consistent is to make sure that they're always on the same side. So for example, right here, let's see, for you it's highlight on the left and shadows are always on the right. So my arm, I've got a highlight on the left and a shadow on the right. My torso, I've got a highlight and then a shadow, and then this arm is kind of mostly in shadow, but if I move it out, it's again highlight and shadow. Same thing with my face, with my neck, with my nose. All of it is consistent, and to our brain, that's how it should be. If, however, like I had a shadow here and a highlight here, your brain would automatically be like, something is wrong. And they'd be distracted by my neck for a while until they were able to figure out what is going on. This is what we want to avoid with our artwork. We want to make sure that everything is as it should be in the natural world, especially if we're working realistically, so that our audience is focused on our subject and what we're actually trying to highlight rather than the fact that we messed up on the shadow. So one trick is just to remember, like, okay, if my highlight or my light source is coming in from the left-hand side, my shadow is always going to be on the right-hand side. So again and again and again throughout each aspect of your painting. Of course, I'm using flowers as an example. You are going to continue to repeat having your shadow on that same consistent side. Tip number 2 is to add shadows slowly with light layers. So with watercolor, or with painting in general, we call those passes, but with watercolor, we specifically call each additional layer a glaze. So a glaze is a very light layer that doesn't have a lot of water because we don't want to reactivate the paint that's underneath, but it has a little bit of water and not too much pigment. And it just kind of adds a light layer. This is a great way to bump up saturation, to deepen a color, or to just kind of clarify some of the details. Working slowly with a glaze in the same color that your initial base layer was in is a great way to build up that intensity and that depth to create that shadow and help to get a nice, smooth, even shadow. And that is the best way to, if you're just starting to apply those shadows, to kind of get to that base form created. If you want a deeper shadow than you can get with your main color, that's when we need to move on to tip 3. Tip number 3 is to add deeper shadows with complementary colors. All right, let's talk about complementary colors. Complementary colors are colors, if you're looking at the color wheel, they are on opposite sides of each other. So red and green, violet or purple and yellow. These are complementary colors. And of course you have all the like nitty-gritty things mixed in there, like yellow, green, and red, violet, all those kind of nitty-gritties in there. But just kind of having that basic understanding will help you as you're trying to add your complements in. By adding a complement in, instead of jumping straight to black, you'll get a much richer color overall. Sometimes if we add black, it just starts to get kind of muddy and you lose some of the depth and the intensity of the color, the richness and the saturation, and it just kind of gets it almost has like a dusty appearance, and it can be hard to get that saturation back once you lose it. So that's why we definitely don't use black when we're starting to create our shadows. You want to start with those complementary colors and kind of build up that intensity. Now, if you're working with something like yellow or a light yellow orange, I don't recommend jumping first into your complementary color. If I'm using yellow, but I want to deepen it and kind of start adding some of that complementary color in there, I like to go for the split complements. So instead of going straight into violet, which can get really dark really fast, especially when you're working with a light color, it can be nice to add kind of more of a blue violet or a red violet. Sometimes I'll even dip into blue or red instead. And while that will give me more of an orange color or more of a green color, that can be a much softer way to start building up some of that intensity rather than jumping into that complement too fast, just because it's kind of like how with black it gets really desaturated. If you jump into purple, if you're working with a yellow subject, it can just get really intense really fast and it can be hard to recover. So having that, look at your piece. If it kind of leans a little bit more green or if it leans a little bit more of that warmer orangey tone, look at those split complements instead of jumping straight into that violet. Which violet is another word for purple. I don't know if that was super obvious or not. Tip number 4 is to remember your highlights. Don't lose your highlights because you're so focused on your shadows. Kind of like when I was talking about with keeping the shadows really consistent. Those highlights will help to push your subject forward and make it look more three-dimensional. Our shadows automatically curve things back and kind of have this effect of like things being sucked into the canvas, and that helps to show depth, but that highlight will help to pop those shapes out. So like a highlight on my nose helps to show there's a nose here, there's something coming out, even though the shadows on the sides also show that there is, some indentation in my face. So also I have these eye sockets here, but having a highlight here or having a highlight here shows that there is something that comes up, not just that there's something that goes back. So having that be consistent, it should be on the opposite side of your shadows, will really help your shading look good overall. Don't be afraid to kind of keep some white space or let that paper show through. If you do need to have a quick glaze over it because it's just a little bit too high key, too sharp, and too light, that's fine. But it's not a bad thing to have a really white pop-in highlight in there. All right, tip number 5, don't get too mad at me. Don't be afraid to use black. Now, I know that I said earlier we don't want to use black when we're making shadows. We really want to stick with the complementary colors. This is true. However, I think that paint was made for a reason, and I think that you can use black paint if you want to. I would just reserve it for those deepest, darkest details, like when you really want that shadow to show that these petals are overlapping, that it gets really, really dark right here. Kind of like if I was to fold my hand like this, I would have these shadows in here, but the black would be reserved for kind of these creases, the very, very tightest parts of the crevices of my hand and these folds, just to show that these are really deep shadows. These are really dark, sucked in areas of my hand that I want to highlight. Now, I wouldn't necessarily include it in here, but definitely like in here, maybe a little bit in here, not so much out here. So it's one of those things that you want to use wisely and use as kind of the last step to really deepen everything up, to allow it to really pop and have those shadows look really sharp and crisp. And again, it's not going to be for every single shape or every single petal, but it is one of those tools that I think is often overlooked because in the art world, we often consider black to be one of the 4-letter words of art, and many artists swear them off, including myself. I did not use black for a long time. I was a purist, but just like I use green shades of paint or purple paint or orange paint instead of just sticking with my primary colors every single time, I do think that it's fine if you want to use black to grab some black. I hope that you found this video helpful and that you have at least one tip that you can take away and start applying to your artwork today. For me, working with shadows with a pencil is second nature. In fact, the reason I thought of this video is because I'm working on filming the second half of my shading course, the ink shading course. The pencil shading course is already up, but shading with a pencil is second nature to me. Shading with ink is a little bit trickier, but shading with watercolor, I really had to work at that during my exploratory period with watercolor and while I was still learning, and I'm still learning every single time I paint. If you have any tips that you would like to add to what I have included here, I'd love to hear them in the comment section down below. And if you found this video helpful, I would really appreciate it if you give me a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos like this. Again, I hope that you found this video helpful. I hope that you are having a wonderful, wonderful day. And until next time, happy painting.